Well, last week we didn't have our normal Bible class because presentation on their work and but the week before that we got through what was that subpoint E, conquest and settlement of Canaan. So again, chapter 4 of our lesson book deals with the 11 periods of Bible history. So we got through the time of the conquest and settlement of Canaan, and we noted that. I don't have the mic. Okay, now it's on. Actually, while I'm thinking about it, let me also check. Let me double check. I don't think that means. Well. No, he looks at it and sees that it needs a better. Marcus, what kind of battery do you need? Okay, yeah, go up to the. Let me. Probably what caused. Evidently the mic, yeah. Putting one in. Got it. So it probably been sitting a while. Not in its current setup. Most of the setup is set up to all charge off the power station. So I don't know if there's a way we can. We're all very fortunate.
extra one or two on the cart.
You should be good now. Yeah. Okay. Let me just verify that the stream has sound. Oh, look at that. Okay, well, now we are good to go. So, last class, again, we got through in our outline on the 11 periods of Bible history, we got through the conquest and settlement of Canaan. And we also mentioned there are different ways to break up the periods of Bible history. This is a very common way, though. But the way this particular method breaks it down, the conquest and settlement of Canaan begins with Joshua leading the people of Israel over the river Jordan, beginning the conquest of Canaan proper, the west side of the Jordan River, that part of Canaan. It begins with that, goes through the end of Joshua's life, goes throughout the time of the judges, goes through the time of Samuel, and it doesn't end until the people of Israel cry out to have a king, and then with the coronation of Saul, the first king of Israel. Now, the reason why we would put all of that in this one period, because we might say, well, no, the conquest and settlement of Canaan, that's just the book of Joshua. Might say, well, maybe a little bit of Numbers, but really it's just Joshua. I mean, maybe you'd put a little bit of the book of Judges. The reason why we put all the book of Judges and the time of Samuel up until Saul is anointed king in this period of time is because the conquest and settlement of Canaan is not something that happens all at once under Joshua. Once we get to, and we talked about this on Wednesday nights when we were going through the book of Joshua, when you get to the beginning of the book of Judges, even after Joshua is dead, the people of Israel are still fighting Canaanites and still working on actually settling in all the land. They haven't actually done it yet. By the time we get to the end of Joshua, the major Canaanite armies have been defeated, the major Canaanite cities have been taken, and the tribal allotments have been divvied out. That doesn't mean they've been fully taken, actually possessed, and settled yet. They haven't been. And that would actually take quite some time. And in fact, that's an ongoing process. And some of that would be going on even after Israel gets a king. But we include all of this in that up to time of the king because there is a fundamental change that happens once Israel anoints its first king. So we include all of that then in this one section. And that one section then takes, over 300 years. We have there at the end of our section, well, toward the end of it anyway, on that period, we note there that the period of the judges lasted more than 350 years. We have a few different references here and there to how long that took. And the time of the judges is the main period of time that makes up this period of Bible history. But when we include the other parts as well, we're getting close to 400 years. Not 400, but we're looking at about that much time between Israel crossing the river Jordan to start the conquest of Canaan and when they finally anoint their first king. Then we begin our next period of Bible history, which is the United Kingdom. And what we mean by that, because we'll get to the next period of Bible history, which is the divided kingdom. This is the period of time where all of Israel, all 12 tribes of Israel, are united in a single kingdom under a single king. Or at least most of the time. There are actually exceptions to that even during the United Kingdom. But that is the general pattern there. So it begins again, Samuel, who is the last of the judges, unique in that as well as being a judge, he is also a priest and a prophet. As he gets old, the people of Israel cry out to him, say, hey, we want to be like the other nations. We want a king. We don't want your sons to replace you. And we talked about that a bit last time. Samuel is very upset by this. And as we mentioned last time, he's not upset because he's offended that they don't want his sons to replace him. He's offended that they don't want to just follow God. To his credit, he's not personally offended for himself and for his own sake. However, God tells him, look, he says, Samuel, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Calm down. He says, but if they want a king, then you can give them a king. And so Samuel does. But per God's instructions, Samuel lets them know, listen, if you want a king, here's the things that you can expect. You are going to lose all of your young men to him because he's going to conscript them all for his army. And all of your young ladies are going to come work for him in the palace. Your tax burden is going to be significantly heavier. You're going to have to support this kingdom with what you are producing. There's going to be costs, and you're not going to like it. And, well, lo and behold, they don't, but by that point it's too late. But the first king that God anoints for the nation of Israel is Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. He was we would say, a farm boy raised on a farm there. Now that would have been rather normal because that's what most of the Israelites were. Saul ends up reigning for 40 years as king in Israel. Now, he reigns for 40 years. He is not, in fact, the rightful king of Israel for 40 years. He does act as the king. He is sitting on the throne as the acting king for 40 years, but the throne doesn't actually belong to him that entire time. And the reason for that is Saul makes a lot of mistakes, but he makes two very big ones. First, he and I always mix these two accounts up. So hold on, let me make sure that I'm getting my sequence correct. He first is too afraid to wait for Samuel, and so he offers to sacrifice himself. So the Israelites are gathered, ready to go to battle. Samuel has told him, you need to wait 7 days till I get there, and when I get there, I'll offer a sacrifice for you all. Then you all can go to battle, and the Lord will be with you. Well, it's the 7th day. It's maybe getting a little bit later in the day. The people are already getting antsy before the 7 days are up. And some of them are ready to go home. They're like, look, we're just sitting around doing nothing. I'm out of here. And Saul gets nervous, and he says, just bring me the sacrifice. I'll offer it real quick, and we can get to work. And the moment he offers the sacrifice, Samuel shows up. And Samuel tells him, he says, listen, because you have disobeyed the Lord. See, God would have established, and Samuel tells Saul this, God would have made the family line of Saul the kingly line of Israel. But because Saul disobeyed God, Samuel tells him, you will not have a son that sits on the throne. Your line is not going to continue on the throne of Israel. Nevertheless, at that point, Saul has not been deposed as king. God just says, your family line will not continue on the throne. But God doesn't say, you are no longer king. He is still king even in God's eyes. But then Saul makes his second great blunder. God instructs the people of Israel to go to war against the Amalekites, one of their oldest enemies, before the Israelites even get to the promised land. Before they even get to the point where they're in Kadesh Barnea, which is where they send out the 12 spies to spy out the land, before any of that happens, while they're marching through the wilderness, the Amalekites come and they attack the rear of Israel's camp as they are marching through the wilderness. Well, you know who generally ends up at the rear of a line of a whole bunch of people walking together? You know who's usually at the back? The slowest, the weakest. The Amalekites attack Israel's camp as they're marching through the wilderness at the rear, unprovoked, before Israel is even in Canaan, before they're near Canaan. And God, as a result of that, instructs the people of Israel several times throughout the Pentateuch. You will not forgive the Amalekites. You will blot them out from under heaven. Now, they do have a battle against the Amalekites while they're in the wilderness. That's the account where Moses is up on the hill holding his staff up, and as long as his arm is up, they're winning. But the moment that his arm goes down, they begin to lose, and so he has to keep his arms up the whole time. And because the battle's been going on, his arms are getting tired, and so Aaron and Hur have to come and help prop his arms up. They're fighting against Amalek when that happens. Well, they defeat that group of the Amalekites, but there's still plenty of them left. Well, fast forward then to when Saul is king, they're going to war against the Amalekites. And this time God says, now it's time to not just win a battle, now it's time to wipe them off the face of the earth. Kill every single one, man, women, children, animals. He goes, I don't want a single remnant left that Amalek ever existed. Everything dies. Saul says, all right. So they go to war against the Amalekites. And they kill almost everyone. But they keep a bunch of the animals. And the king is left alive. And Samuel gets to the camp of Israel and says, what in the world are you doing? And Saul says, look, we did exactly what God told us to do. We defeated them. We slaughtered everything. Isn't this great? And Samuel says, really? You did exactly what God told you to do? What am I hearing then? Why do I hear the sound of a bunch of livestock? And Saul says, well, the people kept them because they wanted to offer some sacrifices. Samuel said, you had instructions from God. That's not okay. And two, the king was still alive. And Saul's like, well, Samuel goes, grabs somebody's sword and cuts the king's head off. He says, no. You were given instructions. Leave no one alive. And because of that, Samuel, by instruction from God, tells Saul, not only has your line been rejected from the throne of Israel, now you have been rejected from the throne of Israel. God's going to replace you now. And at that point, Saul is no longer the rightful king of Israel. He's still the reigning king of Israel, and he will remain on the throne until he dies in battle. But at that point, he is no longer the rightful king of Israel. And immediately after that, God sends Samuel to anoint the new rightful king of Israel. And the second king of Israel then is found not amongst the line of Saul, not amongst the tribe of Benjamin, but amongst the tribe of Judah. Specifically in the household of a man named Jesse, a descendant of Ruth and Boaz from the book of Ruth. Also a descendant of Caleb, one of those righteous spies.
Yeah, before we lay that about Saul, I'll put it on a question and then I'll make a statement after. Do we believe that the people did influence Saul? And if so, shouldn't that serve as an example to us to not allow people, anyone, to convince them to go against God's instruction, no matter what?
Yes. So one of the things that we see, a pattern that we see repeated all throughout the life of Saul, and it's stated pretty early on that he was little in his own eyes. And we might read that as, oh, he was a humble man. That's not what is meant by those words. What's meant by those words is Saul, despite being a very tall man, head and shoulders above all the people, and we've all probably met tall people who are kind of lanky, clumsy might not be the right word, but they're tall, but you wouldn't call them incredibly athletic. They can maybe get by because they're just taller than everybody else and their arms are longer, but they're not incredibly athletic people. David himself describes Saul at his funeral, by the way. David speaks at Saul's funeral. It's a fascinating passage and well worth the read. But David says of Saul, he was swifter than an eagle, stronger than a lion. David was not just a man of war, he was a mighty man of war. He wasn't just a general, he was one of Israel's finest warriors. For David to say, this man was incredible, tells us something about the kind of man Saul was physically. Nevertheless, Saul was small in his own eyes. We would say he had some self-confidence issues. And we see that fear oftentimes affected Saul's decisions. Why did he offer the sacrifice when he was supposed to wait for Samuel? Because the people were getting antsy and some of them were started leaving. He was afraid, if I don't offer it now, they're all going to leave me and I'm going to be left alone. He allowed fear to override his faith in God. Then, why does he end up sparing a bunch of the animals and the king of the Amalekites? Now, we don't actually have God's statement of exactly what happened. We only have Saul's account of what happened. But the thing is, we also have no good reason to think that he's lying. His statement is, look, the animals, the people wanted to keep them. And the king, I was afraid of the people. I just did what they wanted to do. And from everything we know about Saul, we have no reason to assume that's not the truth. He allowed himself to be swayed because of his fear of others, what they would do, what they would think. Are they going to support him? Are they going to like him? He allows that to dictate his actions instead of just putting his trust in God. And yes, he is an excellent example of what not to do in that regard. And it's one of the many ways in which David serves as such a stark contrast to Saul. David is a man who, okay, is he sometimes swayed by what others think? Yes. But David doesn't seem to usually stop and consider what anybody else thinks. He tends to kind of just assume that everybody's going to go along with whatever he wants to do. And when that doesn't happen, sometimes things don't go well. Like when he's out with his men on the run for Saul, and he and his men end up voluntarily acting as guards for a man's flocks. A man named Nadab. Nadab? No, hold on. Am I getting my name's wrong? Oh boy. You're going to have to check me on this. I can remember his wife's name, but not his name. You might not recognize his name, but you'll probably recognize his wife's name, Abigail, who would later become one of David's wives. Anyway, whatever his name is, he's a wealthy man. He has large flocks. Well, in those days, you like watching Westerns, and you always see the subplot about the cattle rustlers. Well, that's a normal thing in the days where most of your wealth and possessions is measured in the size of your flocks. And only with the Israelites, it's sheep. Well, a man who has a lot of sheep then has a lot of potential enemies. And so David and his men, they're passing through, and while they're in that territory, they act as guards for his sheep. And David just assumes, well, if we do this for him, he's going to reward us with at least a little bit of food, maybe some supplies while we're on our way. It's just common decency. And when the man doesn't, it was like, what? You're not going along with what I assumed you would do for me? And we do need to note, David assumes this. He never talks with the man. He never says, hey, let me guard your sheep in exchange for supplies. He has no conversation with him at all. He just says, oh, we'll guard his sheep, but then the man will reward us. There's no conversation, nothing at all, no handshake, none of that. He just assumes, well, everybody goes along with what I want to do, so of course he's going to do it. And when he doesn't, David gets so upset, he says, all right, boys, strap on your swords. We're going to go kill him and every single person in his household. Completely loses his temper until Abigail meets him on the road and calms him down. And once David has finally cooled off, he realizes, oh, I have been a complete idiot. I'm so sorry. We'll leave. Now, very shortly after this, is it? Okay, now I have to go look really quickly. It's driving me insane. When the gentleman in question. Nabal?
Yeah.
Oh, Nabal. Okay. I was close. Thank you. When Nabal hears that David and his men were coming for him, the account's a little bit ambiguous. It kind of sounds as if he's so terrified he literally has a heart attack and dies. When David hears that Abigail is now a widow, he swiftly comes through and rectifies that, and she becomes, well, by this point, already a part of his harem. By this point, David already has at least 3 wives. But David, getting back to our earlier point, is very much the opposite of Saul in so many ways. Part of that is he's not really swayed by what other people are thinking. Now, sometimes that's not a good thing. Sometimes he's just so confident that his decisions are always good that he does some really dumb, rash stuff. And that does get him in trouble. Nevertheless, because he is not swayed by fear, he is never led down that pathway of temptation. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. After God rejects Saul for being king, he sends Samuel to anoint the new king, comes to the house of Jesse. We remember Samuel, there's too many similar names in the Bible. Samuel comes to the house of Jesse and he says, hey, line up all your sons. God has sent me out here on a mission. I want to see all your sons. So Jesse lines them all up, except for David, because David's the youngest. He's out watching the sheep in the field. And so Samuel goes one by one down the line, and God keeps saying, nope, not that one, not that one, not that one. And eventually, he gets to the last one, and Samuel's like, got any more? And Jesse says, well, yeah, the youngest, but he's in the field watching the sheep. And Samuel says, now bring him here. God says, yep, that's the one. He's the one that I want as king. Now, one thing we do need to note here, we oftentimes talk about Goliath and the little boy David. He wasn't a little boy. Say, oh, well, you know, when he goes to fight Goliath, Saul says, here, try on my armor, and the armor's too big for him. Number one, we don't know that because the text doesn't say it was too big. David says, I don't want the armor because I haven't tested it. He's not accustomed to wearing armor. He's never worn it before. Moving with just your normal clothes on, if you're having to do something physical, and then moving with a bunch of weight on that restricts your movement, it's a totally different thing. And if you're not accustomed to it, you don't want to rush right into something important if you haven't experienced that before. The other thing is, even if it was too big for David, Saul was head and shoulders above all the people. Of course it would have been bigger than David would have needed. That doesn't mean he's a child. The other thing is, when David comes before Saul and says, I'll go fight Goliath, and Saul says, what are you talking about? You can't go up against him. You're a young man. He's been a warrior since he was a child. David says, listen, I've been watching my father's sheep since I was little. And whenever a predator would come after one of my father's sheep, I'd go kill that predator. Said that bear or that lion, whatever it is, came for one of my father's sheep, I'd grab that animal by its beard and I'd kill it. Can we just try to visualize what David is describing there? Here's a lion. No, okay, lion. There were lions in Israel. We know that. They weren't African lions, though. Okay, even still, let's say it's the size of a mountain lion here in the United States, although we know that they were bigger than that. But let's go ahead and say it was the size of a mountain lion. How many people do you know would go up to a mountain lion, grab it by its face, and stab it? I don't think I know anybody that would do that. David had already done that multiple times. This is not a child we're talking about. This is a young man who already has experience in doing away with predators. Is he young? Yes. He's not a child. After that, though, in the text, it happens, the account of David and Goliath, of David going into the camp of Israel, fighting Goliath. In the text, it happens immediately after he is anointed king. Now, we don't actually know how much time elapses. But the fact that the Bible keeps, this happens, and then boom, then this happens, it at the very least doesn't incline us to believe that much time had passed. And then immediately after that, Saul has David as a part of his young men. Soldier part-time, but also then David's going to become Saul's personal armor bearer. Now, it does appear from, as we continue on in the text, this is a part-time thing. David is not with Saul all the time because he's still kind of going back and forth. Sometimes he's at home, sometimes he's with Saul. And David is going to end up doing a variety of things. He's going to be Saul's armor bearer. He's going to eventually become a general in Saul's army. But he's also going to be the guy they call whenever Saul's in a really bad mood and they need someone to come in and calm him down a little bit. And David does that with his harp. Now, the exact chronology of the early days of Saul getting to know David, piecing that actually together is surprisingly difficult, and for the sake of this class, it's irrelevant. But there's a bit of time that goes on where David fills a number of positions in connection with Saul. But it appears that Saul is unaware that David has been anointed king. And he takes early on a very strong liking to David. Now we know the moment that David kills Goliath, Jonathan becomes his best friend. Saul's son, his oldest son, he and David immediately become best friends. And no doubt that's part of what makes Saul like David, but Saul himself starts to think of David as a son. And even after Saul's jealousy begins to increase, and this is even before he knows that David has been anointed king, his jealousy begins to grow almost immediately because David's a better warrior. And more than that, he's a better leader. Men feel confident following David. Saul is the anointed king of Israel. He is guaranteed by God's prophet, wait here, offer the sacrifice, and you will be granted complete victory. And the armies want to leave. They don't want to stick around and wait. David ends up having to take off and live in the wilderness on the run for his life, and all the mightiest warriors in Israel say, "We'll follow you wherever you go." Those are two very different kinds of leaders. Well, David begins to display that kind of leadership skill almost immediately. And almost immediately it begins to eat Saul alive. Because again, as we already mentioned, Saul was little in his own eyes. He struggled with his own self-confidence, with self-doubt. And because of that, jealousy had an easy route to get a hold of him. And so, we don't know the exact time frames with a lot of these things, but not long after David becomes Saul's golden boy, David has to take off and run for his life because Saul is actively trying to kill him. Now, Saul literally tries to kill him with his own hand a number of times. He throws a spear at him with the intention of pinning him to the wall on a number of occasions, but then he ends up getting the whole army of Israel to follow him to try to hunt David down. Now,
let's see if I get a laugh out of this, Frank. And women help stir him up.
are we talking about David or Saul?
No, about Saul. Yeah, they gave David too much praise and not Saul.
Yep, coming back from battle, the young ladies begin to sing, yep, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Yep, that doesn't sit very well with Saul. One thing we do need to note here, though, to the credit of Saul. Saul, we know, allowed himself to be controlled by fear, and because of that, jealousy had much too easy of a time getting a hold of him. And he allows it to take him way too far, He ends up killing a bunch of innocent people in his quest to find David. He does some inexcusable things. On 2 occasions, though, while he's in the wilderness, searching for David, David gets the jump on him. The first time, the Bible is, I think, probably intentionally a little unclear, or at the very least euphemistic about what's going on. I think we'd probably be fairly confident in saying that Saul is in a cave, using the restroom. I think is probably the best way we could probably describe what's almost certainly going on there. I don't know what he had eaten, but apparently he wasn't very cognizant of his surroundings. And David was in that same cave further down in. And he is able to sneak up on Saul and cut a little bit off of his robe. And sneak out without Saul knowing. I don't know how that happens. I don't know what else was going on. Maybe there was more Saul was having to do in the cave than just that. But whatever the case, David gets so close he's able to cut a piece off of his robe that Saul's still wearing. What that means is he's more than close enough to have killed him. Easily. But he doesn't. And it's not until Saul and his men are on the next ridge over that David reveals himself and waves that little bit of cloth. And at that point, Saul looks down and realizes exactly what just happened. And Saul goes home. He realizes how foolish and petty he's been. He goes home. Now, unfortunately, he gets riled up once again and goes back out against David. And once again, David gets the jump on him. Saul and his army are asleep. And David and his men come upon their camp as they're all asleep. And David is able to walk right into the middle of the camp and grab Saul's, I can't remember if he grabs his staff or his spear, but he grabs that and he takes it with him. And once again, when they're on the next ridge over, David calls out to him and waves it. Now, what is also interesting, though, David sharply rebukes David's general Abner. Because it was the job of the chief of the king's army to ensure that there was always somebody watching the camp. Now, was that probably in part God's handiwork? Yeah, probably so. But when Saul sees that, he profusely apologizes to David, calls him my son, goes home, and never again comes after David. Now, we also need to note, David realizes he's just not going to be safe in Israel, and so he takes off and he leaves Israel temporarily to the land of the Amorites. Or Amorites? One of the Canaanite tribes that starts with an A. I think it's the Amorites. But anyway, he leaves Israel. He realizes, I'm not safe here. So, is that maybe part of why Saul never comes after him again? Well, maybe, but Saul's already fought against cities before to try to get at David. So I don't know that we can necessarily chalk it all down to that. But Saul never again comes after David after that happens. But that doesn't right all the wrongs that he has done, and God had still already rejected his line from sitting on the throne and rejected him from being the king. Sometime after that, again, we don't know the exact time frame of all of this. We're not given a strict chronology of how long all of these different steps take. But again, after the end of those 40 years, Saul and Jonathan die in battle. At that point, the tribe of Judah, rather, recognizes David as the rightful king. Up until that point, nobody has recognized David as the king of Israel. God has anointed him. He's been anointed for quite some time. He's been the rightful king of Israel, but it isn't until after Saul dies that the tribe of Judah recognizes him as king, and David then reigns in Hebron for, I believe it's 7 years, if I'm remembering. Oh, yes, it's in our outline there, yes. He reigns for 7 years, just as the king of Judah and Hebron. And the reason why only one tribe followed him is that all the other tribes follow Ishbosheth, one of Saul's younger sons. Now, Ishbosheth was never in line to inherit the throne. Again, that would have been Jonathan. But with his father and his older brothers now dead, Ishbosheth claims the throne for himself. What's important for us to note is Ishbosheth has absolutely no legitimate claim to the throne whatsoever. His line was rejected by God from ever sitting on the throne, and then his father was rejected from sitting on the throne. He is not anointed by anyone. He is a usurper. He has no legitimate claim to the throne. Nevertheless, he has the right daddy. And so nobody questions it. The other thing is, Saul's general, Abner, backs Ishbosheth. Now we know in many ways Abner was a man of good character. But Abner was very far from a great man. He backed a usurper and only stopped backing Ishbosheth when Ishbosheth insulted him. And then he defected to David. Abner was a man of some character, but deeply flawed, in that he was more loyal to a family line which did not have a right to rule Israel than he was loyal to Israel, or more importantly, to God. Now ultimately, Abner meets his end when the commander of David's army, Joab, assassinates him. Now, in many ways, Joab is the clearest thinking individual in this entire saga of Saul and David and all the people that follow him. But Joab also is the most unscrupulous. And Joab doesn't murder Abner just because of the dumb things Abner had done. He did it out of petty revenge. Abner had legitimately killed Joab's brother in battle, even though Abner had given Joab's brother every opportunity to run away. Joab did this out of revenge. But it's only after Abner dies and then Ishbosheth is ultimately assassinated as well. It's only after both of their assassinations that all of Israel then eventually recognizes David as the king of Israel. And David ends up ruling also for a total of 40 years. He ends up making his capital Jerusalem until David makes Jerusalem the capital. Jerusalem, for most of the history up to this point, didn't even belong to the Israelites. It was a city of the Jebusites, a Canaanite tribe, that they had been temporarily defeated under Joshua, but they had moved back in and they had never been defeated again. So David conquers Jerusalem while he's king and then makes it his capital city. And it's only at that point that Jerusalem becomes that capital city. It becomes, under the third king of the United Kingdom, the city where the temple is located. But up to that point, it didn't even belong to the Israelites. They didn't even have possession of it. But we are very out of time, so we better close there. So next week, we will finish up the United Kingdom and at least get into the divided kingdom. We'll see how much further we get. But we'll, at least finish up the United Kingdom. But there's a lot of very important stuff that happens at the beginning of the founding of Israel's kingdom, so we wanted to go a little bit slower through that, but we'll try to handle at least some of these sections a little bit quicker so that we move through faster than the last chapter. But we'll go ahead and close there for this morning, and let's do so with a word of prayer. Our dear loving God and Father, thank you for this day that you have blessed us with. Thank you for the chance that we have to be here together and to be able to study your word. Help us always to have open minds and hearts to what you have written. Help us to come to know you better. Help us to come to know your will for our lives, and help us to have the desire, the humility, and the self-control to put that into practice in our lives. We pray that you would be with us today as we offer worship to you. We pray that we will please you with all that we do, being done in spirit and in truth. And it's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.